You are kind of dressy. Should I be more dressy?
No, this is my casual.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Pass the Power with me, Paige Parker. I am really delighted to have you listening, and for many of you, you are watching on Spotify and on the new YouTube channel, and I'm very excited that you're with us so that we can share conversations of hope and pass the power with people like Jamus Lim, who is going to talk with me about education today. I think he's most well known as a politician and a member of the Opposition Workers' Party. You're also an associate professor in the economics department at Essec Business School. And in doing homework for the podcast, when I visited your website, I had complete imposter syndrome because you have more degrees than any other guest we've ever had on here, and you're a professor. And I just want to share with you, the listeners and the audience, this is from Jamus's website, which is quite witty, with a bit of humble brag here and there. And this is just his list of academic achievements.
Now you make me embarrassed.
The most recent notch on my overeducated curriculum vitae is a postdoctoral fellowship at the SAFRA Research Lab at Harvard, as well as a liberal arts master's in history from the same institution. Prior to that, I suffered through my doctorate in international economics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I somehow also finagled my way into a master's in politics. And before that, I endured a master's at the London School of Economics after jumping through undergraduate hoops at the University of Southern Queensland. For those of you listening who can't see me, I'm holding up 6 fingers because that's 6 degrees. And that's just your academic achievements, not including all of your impressive work experience. So we know all this about you. Can you tell us who's the real Jamus Lim?
Well, first of all, thank you, Paige, for having me and putting me through the embarrassing laundry list of degrees. Here's an interesting story. When I was going to elementary school, I remember my mother had great difficulty getting me there, so she dragged me literally kicking and screaming from the parking lot to school, and I think she was just happy that I managed to make my way through kindergarten and school. I guess she regretted now, possibly wishing that I would stay in school because it seems like I never left.
So it's 6 degrees?
Who's counting?
I was counting there.
There you go. You were. But for an economist, I'm not good at numbers.
Oh, so we're going to talk about education today. And well, actually, did you tell us who the real Jamus Lim is? Is there anything besides the academics that we need to know about you? I think you have a wife, a daughter.
I do. So I am a father to a beautiful 3.5-year-old daughter who is now together with my wife, and my wife is Chilean American. She grew up in Chile and then ultimately in Pennsylvania.
I've read some of her poetry.
It's beautiful.
It really is.
I always think of it as, I think of myself as very lucky that I matched with someone that was just completely different in terms of how we look at things. I tend to be very rational and very methodical in how I approach a problem, and she goes so much more with emotions, but there are such strong intuitions, and I've learned through experience how to trust those intuitions and how there is an entire dimension that if you allow to blossom and embrace, add so much variety and spice to a relationship. So I am immensely grateful.
For me, I'm the mother of 2 daughters, and along with my husband Jim, we moved from New York to Singapore because we wanted them to be immersed in Mandarin. I worked really hard to get my daughters into the school that I thought they should go to. I drank the Kool-Aid. I was a parent volunteer. I moved within 1 kilometer. And I remember when we first moved here, Jim was making a speech. A lady in the audience raised her hand and kind of exclaimed, you're working so hard to get into the system, and all we want to do is get out. Okay. Is the system here just too much?
To be completely fair, I think every system has its strengths and weaknesses. Some parents find that the system is stressful. Others appreciate pressure that is felt early on, because a big part of that picture also entails what parents are willing to do to get their children up to speed and running at the same pace. So as you shared, many parents are willing to put their kids through additional supplemental classes. They're willing to move just so that they can get to specific schools that have certain reputations. A very, very common experience in Singapore is a willingness to pay for additional private tuition, especially in subjects that the kids have fallen behind in. So what this means is that there's a parallel system. So there's the regular system that is reasonably successful, but then there's a parallel system that gets you the results that we ultimately observe. It's an incomplete picture to just say that the system in and of itself that we've observed is the full picture.
We often hear negative sentiment about the education system here, but I do think the children are being reared at a very high level. They're coming out incredibly competent. And I look at what's happening in America, where I'm from, and where I went to school with my little town of 50,000 people, and the people don't have noun-verb agreement. They can't do multiplication. So I think the rigor and the level of education that's demanded of students here, I'm all for it.
So I hear where you're coming from. And I think it's true that if you look at systems around the world, even in fairly advanced economies, where they fall short in educating and equipping their students for the kind of workforce that's necessary for the future. The system works well if you are a student that has a certain endowment of innate talent, of capability, but it falls short if you happen to be a little different, if you're neurodivergent, if you happen to be a late bloomer, if you are someone that excels in a type of intelligence that differs from traditional academic intelligence, then the system doesn't draw out the best in you. So you can think of many examples where while we produce excellent workers at one level and they go on and some of them break into some of the best universities in the world, at the same time, they don't have the same kind of flair, the same kind of creative spirit, I think, that characterizes students from some other systems. I think that our students, when they were born at least, weren't like this. They weren't necessarily weaker in sport or in the non-academic subjects like music or sport or art. It's just that the system channels the energies of all our students towards specific endeavors, and then it leaves these other ones. And again, one may say that these are precisely the ones that we want our workforce of the future to possess. But then I think if we do that, we suddenly leave behind so many additional dimensions that ultimately makes human flourishing interesting, and it makes civilization as we know it. Think of all the achievements that we have accomplished as a human civilization. How often it gravitates towards academic ones? Certainly, we have Nobel Prizes and we have kudos academic achievements, but at the same time, we justifiably celebrate Oscars and Grammys. We justifiably celebrate the beautiful art that's being produced as part of human civilization. And I think where Singapore has fallen short is being able to likewise create a system that carries these individuals that are just distinct and different, but nevertheless just as valuable up along.
I agree with you on that, because not every child is going to be a triple science excellent student. That obviously is what is appreciated here more than people in the arts or in the humanities. The next thing I want to talk about is a memorable incident related to education. And this reminds me that we are all the products of the good and bad of our parents. And I think that the reason that I've been such a kind of a proud tiger mom when I got here to my daughters, because I had, dual working parents. We didn't have a helper, and they expected me to do well, but I don't think they pushed me hard enough. My mom, I would get 87 out of 100, and my mom would say, "Did you do your best?" And I'd say yes, and she said, "Okay." And my daughters, if they got 98 out of 100, I would say, "Why did you miss the 2 points? Did you not know the content? Did you not prepare enough?" Because I'm convinced when they're young, we have to push them very, very hard. We're not innately driven until a certain age. And I think by the time they get midway through primary school, upper primary school, they're pushing themselves. And as parents, we need to take our foot off the gas. And if at that point we see they're not academic, then we start to tiger on what we know they're good at. We can't expect them all to be triple science majors. The way my parents reared me made me the tiger mom, but the Singapore school system made me a more tamed tiger mom, because I saw how hard my children were working.
I think that ultimately what almost any parent wants is for our children to be able to find what it is that they love in life. It's a bit cliched, but to find their passions, if you will. But just as important, if they have certain God-given talents, for them to push themselves to the maximum of their ability, and hopefully and then some, so that they truly are able to blossom within whatever it may be that they have been blessed with. That said, there are, just by the nature of the distribution of human talent, going to be those among us that don't manage to attain that level. And what we don't want to do is to push our kids in a certain way where they fall in the distribution, feel that somehow they are inadequate, somehow that they are not worthy, somehow that they don't have a purpose. It is our role as parents to help our kids find that purpose. And that purpose may be something a lot more pedestrian than what you have decided to push your kids to, and what, to be quite honest, my mother, who was also a tiger mom, the kind that pushed me when I got a 98, why I didn't get the 100. But yet, I think we need to also allow for the possibility that there are some children that just don't have that, no matter how hard they try, and they need to know that they're just as valued and just as loved.
So tell us a memorable incident.
When I was younger, I would usually be a troublemaker. I'm still a troublemaker in many ways. I routinely went to the principal's office, and at the time you could be caned. One of my teachers decided that I was less disruptive if he put me in the trash bin. So in I went. Apparently I reveled in being in the trash bin. I was very happy. I was still able somehow to distract people while I was in it.
This is giving me Sesame Street vibes.
Yeah, there you go. And I do like Oscar. And through it all, it came down to the fact that I was a little bit bored, and it took perhaps the unintentional brilliance of a primary 3 form teacher who saw that I had all this energy wasn't being channeled appropriately. So in that stroke of brilliance, she made me a group leader of a group of other troublemakers in the class. She brought out a certain degree of leadership in me, and also a sense of competitiveness in the rest of my mates. In the end, for those that I've since reconnected, one of them is now an entrepreneur, went to Michigan for undergraduate studies. Another is a successful wealth manager, went on to Carnegie Mellon. My point, we can't tell at a young age when a kid is going to blossom. Perhaps they would fall by the wayside. If teachers have a certain ability and flexibility to be able to exercise their best judgment as teachers, they may be able to bring out the true potential of the kids under their charge. This sort of flexibility sometimes, to go back to the Singapore educational system, can be missing, either because we're now a sufficiently advanced economy where such flights of flexibility may land the teacher in serious trouble.
The front page of the Straits Times.
Among other things. Or because teachers themselves just don't feel empowered to have that kind of ability to nurture and to push the kids in a certain way.
So you were talking about too much of the status quo, and I feel that part of the issue in the system is the syllabus that the teachers have to get through is so extensive that there's not time for nurturing. There's not enough time for kids to actually raise their hand and say, can we talk about XYZ?
So here's an interesting lesson, and I learned this the hard way. So professors, unbeknownst to much of the public, don't actually go through lessons on how to teach. So we're pretty much thrown in deep end, and you're just told, okay, here's your class, go ahead and teach. When many assistant professors start off, their goal is, I have all this knowledge, I need to pass this on to my students. I only have one semester, I only have a certain amount of time, 10 weeks. I need to make sure I get through as much material as possible. And then you realize, of course, that you can, if you choose, to cram material, and the very best of the students will ultimately be able to embrace and absorb all that material. But you tend to lose a lot of students that way. And more importantly, you tend to not allow the rest of the classroom to internalize some of the key lessons that you think is ultimately a lot more important than all the minute details. So for me, I think over time what I've done is I've learned that less can truly be more. And again, I know this sounds like a cliche, but that if you were willing to trim things down to just a few key lessons, a few key ideas, and make sure that these are deeply understood, that has a lot more lasting ability and a lot more ability to influence the way that the student ultimately thinks about issues than if you just gave them a lot of information and the best among them would be able to replicate all the information, but without that deep understanding that allows them to be able to use that information in a different context.
Does that mean more engagement with them?
Certainly. So a part of that, I'm in the business school, so a big part of what we do is we have case studies where we have these conversations. And of course, with case studies and anything where there's a conversation with more of a Socratic method, it's more taxing on the teachers. The teachers have to both prep and be able to react to responses by the students, to encourage them not to shoot it down just because it seems to be an inane idea, but at the same time to be able to channel them toward ultimately what is a more credible answer to what they say. So it does take a little bit of experience, and it does take some degree of empathy and patience, but I think that bears a lot more fruit than just kind of expecting the student to just download all the information that you share
and then regurgitate it back.
Our role as educators, I think, increasingly becomes one where what we need to do is to help our kids process, filter, assess the quality of information, and be able to make sense of potentially unrelated elements so that they can ask tools like ChatGPT the right kind of questions. For them to ask the right questions, they do have to have some base level of knowledge. So I'm not saying that you just completely give up on information and knowledge transfer, but that has to be paired with ensuring that they learn tools. And it's with those tools that are ultimately going to be the most valuable for them in not just the educational, but ultimately their life journey.
So they're bigger thinkers, right?
That's what we want. I think we want everyone to feel that they have ownership and agency to ask questions. And I think asking questions is far more important than being able to answer them per se.
Are most of the students Singaporean?
Well, it's a mix. A small fraction from Singapore, but many from other Southeast Asian countries around us, and usual suspects, China, India, and then we have a lot of French students. But to be quite honest, I don't see the French educational system tends to be quite top-down as well. So I don't see a dramatic difference necessarily in their high school education, such that when they come to us, that they are necessarily as free-thinking as, and this is one of the strengths of the American system that I know that you have some issues with. It certainly has an ability to instill a sense of confidence in being able to challenge ideas, to be able to articulate ideas, sometimes in a wrong-headed fashion, but nevertheless confidently being able to express a certain point of view. I think that's
I think those things are very important. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask, because the stereotype is that if you put a group of students together, the Singaporeans are never going to raise their hand and ask a question. So do the Singaporean students, do they question you like the other nationalities in the room?
I think once it becomes clear that this is the style of engagement and education that we want, this is a safe space in the classroom to present such ideas, then Singaporeans are just as capable of unlearning some of those more traditional habits and going in and engaging.
So last question here. Is class participation graded in your class?
Yes, in fact, and it's not just class participation. I think exams are increasingly passé. In fact, I don't have closed book exams any longer. To the extent I have exams, they are open book, because I think that the wealth of information that's available to anyone in a regular setting should be available to the student during an exam setting, because ultimately that's the kind of problems that they have to solve in real life. I believe in continual assessment. So beyond the case studies that I mentioned, a lot of my problem sets get them to engage. And I always tell the students, look, work in a group. I need an independent write-up. You need to make sure that whatever you submit isn't plagiarized. You don't just change your name at the top of the submission. But it's important that you learn how to work in a group. That is ultimately a key skill in life. And the process of sitting down and talking out the problem with your classmates, that itself gives you insight. In the real world, and I think that's the kind of engagement I want them to have, even outside of the classroom.
No, I think that's reassuring what you're saying. I think a great case study that's going to come up will be FTX. Although I don't know how in depth we can go there, but
what I will say is that very often in our case studies, there isn't a single correct answer. And I think we need to realize this. In the heat of the moment, anyone in that decision maker role can make mistakes. So the role of the case study is to help individuals, students in this case, put themselves the best they can in the shoes of the decision maker at the time, with all the constraints and all the pressures that the decision maker faces, and ideally to see where they made a mistake and to be reflective enough that were they in a similar situation in the future, they would be able to take a step back and be reflective enough to say, okay, I think that this is not the right course of action for whatever reason, and hopefully avoid a disaster that one could easily sleepwalk into.
Yeah, I don't think he was sleepwalking, FTX. But speaking of pressure, the next thing I want to talk about is a daily challenge we face pertaining to education. And I have a few. The first is people are like, oh, you're so lucky your daughters are smart. And I'm like, yeah, they're smart, but they also work very, very hard. It's not like they're innately gifted and it just kind of comes to them. They work. And the other is understanding that grades don't define our children. I am constantly asked, because both of my daughters have done well in school, people are like, tell us, like, how did you do it? And at the end of the day, if they get a grade that's not terrific and they worked really hard, you still have to be proud of them. And then the final is, I am challenged not to put onto my daughters my wants and desires for them, and to let them live according to, kind of what brings them joy in their heart. And I know initially when they were younger, I certainly pushed them very hard in directions that I thought were important, and as they grow up and evolve. So I think as a parent, those are kind of the three big things that daily I try to get myself out of my silo mind and face these challenges.
Well, Paige, my daughter's 3.5 and we have problems getting her to bed. So I would say this. There is actually scientific evidence behind this that suggests that those who are in their teenage years, they tend to thrive a lot more with a later schedule. It is much better for them to sleep in and work till the wee hours of the morning. Most of us ultimately grow out of it, but who am I to say that someone who decides that they do their best work at 2 or 3 in the morning shouldn't be pursuing this style of work? So my sister, as it turns out, she was always one of those that worked till 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes 4. And funnily enough, she still does this in her professional life. She does marketing and sales. And she still decides that sometimes all-nighters are the way that she can be most productive in channeling her energies to creating something special. So again, I don't think there's anything to say that that's a worse way. On the other hand, for me, I do my very best work very early in the morning. Sometimes I wake up at 5:30 and I would go hammer out several pages of material. And for me, that really works. So everyone will have to find their own equilibrium when it comes to working. I do hope that our national educational system considers is that, at least given the circadian rhythms that teenagers very typically face, that we do consider having later start times. So your second point was a little bit about
not letting grades define a child.
And I can't emphasize how important that is. It is really hard as a parent when you face this temptation to compare. Here's the problem. Grades ultimately assess how well you have done according to the scope of the expectations of that course. What they don't do is transfer beyond that topic. Sometimes the ones that thrive the most are the ones that struggle early on, but yet their strengths are in challenging accepted wisdom, asking unusual questions, methodically, and perhaps not in a sophisticated way, but in a very systematic and steady fashion, probing at that issue from all possible angles. And then you have final point. We often want to live vicariously through other people, and often it is our kids. For me, I try my level best not to do so. In part, my dad passed early on in my life, and so I became a bit of a de facto father figure to my sister. It was tempting for me to ask her to do all the things that I didn't manage to fulfill in my university career in her own. In the end, she ended up pursuing something diametrically opposite to anything I would have wanted her to do. The only thing I insisted was that she had to take some calculus classes, just because you need to exercise that part of the brain. But beyond that, she found her own way, and she has found tremendous success in her career. Ironically, her first job was in part a springboard from what she studied as a major. She didn't study marketing, she studied Japanese studies, and her first job was with a Japanese firm. It was her ability to pull from her natural strengths that had very, very little to do with the grades and how she did in her university coursework.
So tell us a daily challenge you face in education.
So my daughter is still young, so I don't imbue on her a lot of expectations, but nevertheless, I think even for as young as the kids are, you worry, all parents do, about them picking up basic things. But here's the thing. I think almost every kid gets there at a different pace. When we live in such a quantified society, that we often have these benchmarks.
When did your child walk?
Yeah, exactly. So
when did she say her first word?
And the thing about these benchmarks, Paige, is that they were almost always constructed as the average of a whole bunch of kids. But nobody is perfectly average. Some kids will have walked much earlier. Other kids would have spoken their first word much earlier. Yet others would have some mathematical ability very early on, but yet they may be lagging behind in a whole bunch of other things. So when we try to always make sure that they're meeting these benchmarks, then we are selling them short on allowing them to develop the areas that they truly were blessed with. So for me, I think that's one challenge that I face, which is to make sure that I don't, as much as you have a responsibility to, I feel a responsibility to read to my daughter in bed so that she at least hears the sounds of words and stories and absorbs English language. My wife reads to her in Spanish, so she gets that from my wife. And at the same time, ensure that she is also able to find her own space, her own equilibrium, where she really wants to thrive in. And for my daughter, it turns out it tends to be in much more physical activities. So we are trying to push her to develop that as much as she can.
So she's going to be a jock?
We'll see. I think she certainly has a lot of upper body strength. So
Gymnast?
She's been climbing wall structures. And were we more risk-loving parents, I think she would be going even further than we have allowed her to, but we'll see.
Thank you for being with us, Jamus.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Anything else on education? All done?
I am educated out.
With 6 degrees, you should be. So that wraps another episode of Pass the Power with me, Paige Parker. I'm so glad to have you listening and also watching on the new YouTube channel. Please message me with ideas on guests you'd like for us to have on the show. I love being here and doing this, and we will keep passing the power one episode at a time.